Hi, I'm Randy Picker, and I'm a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Thank you so much for asking me to participate in your conference on the digital revolution. The fact that we're able to do this way, I know you're on Zoom, and here I am filming on Sunday in Chicago. It says something about that revolution. I hope everyone's okay. I've looked at the coronavirus numbers in Peru. I know what they look like in the United States. I hope everyone's doing okay. So I was asked to talk about something related to antitrust and digital platforms, and so I've decided to focus on smartphones. I think that's been an incredibly interesting space and continues to be, and there's lots of legal action too. And the fact that iOS and Android are really sort of almost universally dominant across the world, maybe not in China, means that there's certain a common setting for us to work with there. So that's part of what I like about it. So I want to go back in some sense to what I think of as the beginning. If you haven't watched Steve Jobs launch the iPhone, I don't want to say stop right now and do that, but after you've done watching me, go do that, or after you're done with the conference, go do that. The launch of the iPhone is one of these historic events. Jobs was a fabulous presenter. Apple product launches, most of them are on YouTube, and they're very much worth watching. And he pitched this as you can see on the screen, this is from the Apple press release. This is January of 2007. Pitched it as, three revolutionary devices. And that's in some sense what they were trying to do here. Apple had really transformed the company with the launch of the iPod. Apple before the iPod and after the iPod are just two completely different companies. But there were these other devices out there. Obviously there were cell phones, and so we now had MP3 players, which is what the iPod was, cell phones. And then these Palm Pilots, the PDAs, personal digital assistants, and the ability to sort of combine all three of these into one device. That was the convergence that the iPhone represented, but really in a completely different form factor. So everyone understood what that convergence might look like. Indeed, Apple had pursued it earlier with the Newton, if you know that history, which is a very interesting history. Same vision, just not the tools to execute it. So the launch of the iPhone really transforms the smartphone space. It doesn't happen immediately, and it's worth noting that. So replaying that history a little. So this revolutionary device and revolutionary interface, what it did not have at the launch was the App Store. So there's basically a year-long gap between the original, maybe a year and a half, between the original launch of the iPhone and the App Store. And the iPhone didn't get a firm traction immediately. It takes a while for the physical device to get out. But you don't have what we think of as a huge part of this, which is sort of the iOS ecosystem. But by July of 2008, as they're rolling out the 3G iPhone, they also roll out an early app store, 500 native applications. You see that seems like a small number on the one hand compared to what we have today. It's not a bad start, but a completely different vision for this. And so the App Store really takes this device and makes it a platform, makes it an ecosystem. And it's really that point, obviously along with Android, that really transforms the smartphone space. So say a few words about Android. Google bought Android. And people talk about, there's a discussion these days of killer acquisitions and the like. I don't want to say too much about that. I do want to say that companies can buy products and turn them into better products. And that's almost certainly what happened here with Google buying Android. And it's also noteworthy that other people, Samsung in particular, had the chance to buy Android and said no. I think it's always worth looking at almost the competition to buy good technology, and that's what you see here with what Google did in buying Android. Okay, so Android takes a while. They reconfigure it. We'll go back for just a second. I think they buy Android in 2005. Really doesn't roll it out as a product until 2008. I think they reconfigured that product in the light of what the iPhone does. Now, the iPhone really reset the bar for what we expected smartphones to accomplish. And Google rolls this out, and in similar fashion is rolling out, the chance to have software, to have an app store. In their case, what we call Google Play. Now, we'll say more about Android in a few minutes here. Indeed, quite a bit more. But take stock on where we are at the point where the iPhone and Android roll out. So we had a market that was dominated by a handful of firms. So Nokia had its Symbian operating system. I don't know that we call those smartphones, feature phones maybe. Research in Motion is obviously BlackBerry. The BlackBerry starts as really an email device. Eventually they turn it into a kind of smartish phone, I guess. And BlackBerry was obviously enormously successful. You see Microsoft on that list with a 12% market share in 2007. Microsoft was an active participant in the early days of smartphones. And again, we'll talk about that in a little more here, in more detail in a little bit. You see some other names down there. Mac is just coming along. Mac OS, as I suspect we're picking up in 2007, the iPhone there. It didn't even get started calling it iOS. I don't know the date on that off the top of my head, but not initially. All right, that was 2007. And I think what's remarkable here is a situation where we had clearly a leading player in Symbian, dominant. We had some other firms that were extremely successful in the space. Certainly BlackBerry was. And Microsoft was trying to extend its position from the desktop into this new mobile world. Android, Google, no obvious advantages. And Apple was a company that really prior to the release of the iPod in 2001 was sort of not doing very well. They faced a takeover offer in 1996. So it's not obvious that Apple and Google, when you think about the competition between Google and Apple and Nokia, BlackBerry, Microsoft, it's not obvious who would have won that competition and why. But of course we know what happened. So StatCounter puts out some great statistics. And as you can see, this is worldwide mobile OS market shares, basically as of now. And you can see that Android's roughly 74% and iOS is 25%. I'll do a little quick math here. 74 plus 25, that's 99. Two firms, 99% of the market. It's a powerful duopoly. And you can see that Symbian is gone. Microsoft eventually buys Nokia, almost certainly wasted, I don't know, $7 billion there. Windows, no meaningful market share here, and BlackBerry in similar fashion. So the transformation of this market is part of what is really quite remarkable. I was showing you on the last slide just what the figures were at a particular point in time, basically today. This slide shows you the transformation between 2009 and 2020. You can see that I guess it's orange, reddish orange line. The rise of Android is really quite remarkable over that time. Mac and iOS, as you can see, is that obviously sort of grayish line that there's basically consistency for a while there, and that's obviously the world we live in today. Now, take one other spin at that, just to assess the situation. So this is a different set of statistics. This looks at sort of worldwide operating system market shares, so not just mobile, but also ask what's going on the desktop. And now we see a different position. And you see Android 38, Windows roughly 37, iOS, and then OS X, which is the Macintosh, those total to maybe 22, 23. it really looks like a three-horse race there. And that's to say that even as mobile has expanded, Windows' position on the desktop has remained fairly constant. And you can see again, this gives you, you can see the decline, as it were, of Windows. But that decline is not, you'll see the next slide, is not because Windows' position on the desktop has been changing, but rather it's because the desktop has become that much smaller a share of our digital lives. As lots of people who didn't have computers have added smartphones, and even those of us who've had computers for a very long time have shifted how we allocate our work between the personal computer and handheld mobile tablets and smartphones. Indeed, as you can see, the worldwide position of Windows on the desktop, it's declined a little, but it's really been remarkably steady over this period between 2009 and 2020. And do think back for a second to think about the various antitrust actions that were taken against Microsoft. The ones I know best are the US case in 2000, the subsequent cases in Europe. Those cases were in some sense quite successful from an antitrust standpoint. Microsoft lost in the United States 7-0 in front of a DC circuit on the monopoly maintenance claim, and effectively lost the server interoperability and the Windows Media Player case, and then settled the Internet Explorer case. And yet, notwithstanding those remedies, notwithstanding those successes, Microsoft's position on the desktop hasn't really changed in important ways. What's changed is the role of the personal computer in our lives, but not really Microsoft's position in the laptop or personal computer part of the world. It's interesting, actually. Again, of lots of antitrust action, but it's not obvious that that's actually had meaningful consequences. Now, I want to say just one more thing here, because I gave you a sense of on mobile, the Android market share and the iOS market share. And that was, I don't know, 75-24, I think it was, worldwide, so roughly 3-1. There's a different way to spin that, and this will give us a little bit of a sense of the richness of this space. So this is Sensor Tower's figures on App Store revenues, and those have just been rising. You can see 23% higher than they were a year ago over the same period. The fact that we're all staying at home means we're doing a lot of screen time. And I think that's good for both the Google Store, the Google Play, and the App Store for Apple. If you actually look at the revenue, Apple is roughly 2/3 of the revenue. So if you look at total revenue flowing through the Apple App Store, revenue flowing through Google Play, even though the market share on the devices and the market share on the OSs, as it were, is 3-1 in favor of Google, the actual revenue is really 2-1 in favor of Apple. And that reflects the fact that Android reaches a large part of the world. Not everyone spends a lot of money on apps throughout the world, and that the Apple reaches a more affluent market. And so there's actually more money in that market. And so when you figure out how to think about market shares here, I don't think we should leap too quickly into assuming that either OS market share or handset market share is the relevant number. My guess is we're going to need to slice that down just a little bit. And these figures from Sensor Tower is just sort of one window into that. Okay, so that's sort of a way of framing the statistics. Let's start to head towards the legal side of this a little. These are two-sided markets. We have these platforms, Android, and then the associated Google products. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Android's open source, but it's much more complicated than that. Apple is obviously highly vertically integrated, but both of them are running two-sided platform structures where they're trying to attract developers on the one side of the market and users, you and me, on the other side of the market. So the developer programs are important here. That's not new. Microsoft famously was very good with developers on Windows. You need people to write software. And so Apple runs an app store to attract developers. They are part of their customer base. Developers are effectively Apple customers. Users are effectively Apple customers. And the distribution and audience gathering capabilities that Apple brings to bear through the App Store is obviously an important part of what Apple is selling to developers. They're fairly, they are aggressive with regard to curating the App Store. That is part of what they do. And as you know, in these digital markets, the question of how much filtering should take place by the intermediaries, should Google and Facebook do more of that? But Apple is a fairly aggressive curator of apps. And that, I think that goes back to Steve Jobs. I think that's a very long-held belief. One of the things that's become increasingly controversial is the price that Apple charges. And that's complicated, and we'll talk about that a little bit towards the bottom, though not in as great a detail as we might like to. But Apple charges basically a 30% commission. That figure, I think, goes back to the original Apple Music Store. When Apple rolled out the iPod, they actually didn't have a music store. They eventually added a music store. That took a lot of negotiations with the music industry to get to that point. And that's where they started charging this 30% figure. That's been remarkably sticky. But remember, as they emphasize here, many apps there are no fees for with regard to at all. You pay $100 to be an Apple developer, but if your app is advertising supported, you don't pay Apple anything. If you're Uber, it turns out, you basically pay Apple very little. But they do charge. If you're saying, I bought a camera app once that cost me $15. And that app, Apple charges, Filmic Pro is the app. They charge them $15, 30%, $4.50. If you're running a subscription service and Apple's having conflicts with Spotify, there was a period where you could go from free Spotify to premium Spotify within the app, and Apple would get a 30% cut of the first year on that. That's where the controversies are, and we'll see towards the end, the European Union is currently investigating that. But this 30% figure has really been there at least since the beginning of the music store. All right, so how should we think about the App Store? And I want to take a couple of runs at those ideas. The United States Supreme Court looked at this issue in 2019 in an opinion, Apple versus Pepper. And the real issue in this case is who could sue Apple? The United States has something called the indirect purchaser doctrine, which sort of limits where in the chain you can bring an antitrust suit. Apple wanted to say that the people suing them in this case couldn't sue them. And the Supreme Court said in a sort of an interesting political lineup, if you care about these things, so Justice Kavanaugh is a young, newly confirmed, a couple of years ago, conservative judge, but it was Kavanaugh along with the 4 liberal justices saying, we don't know what to do about the Illinois brick doctrine, as we call it exactly, but however it applies normally, at least in this digital marketplace, we should say that both the developers and the users have direct relationships with Apple. And that means both should be able to bring suits against Apple, antitrust suits, if Apple's engaging in some sort of monopolization. It's an interesting opinion in the sense that, and I tweeted about it as if that's the right way to approach Supreme Court opinions, but you do want to talk about them as they come out, and Twitter's pretty good for that. As you read the opinions, I didn't find either one of them particularly satisfying. I don't think actually their description of the actual business arrangements matches what Apple certainly says about those arrangements. At the same time, I thought the analysis of the opinion the analysis and the majority opinion, which effectively treated this as a two-sided market, though without using those words, was right. And that would naturally mean that both the developers and the users would be well positioned to sue to assert potential monopolization claims. And that's the result that we get here. So the part of what we're having to wrestle with in the United States is, as we have these two-sided platforms and we raise issues of standing as we think of them, who has the right to bring the lawsuits. The Apple versus Pepper case is going to open up antitrust to more suits in these situations, as both users on one side or the other side will be well situated to bring these lawsuits. So Apple's a big deal. Apple versus Pepper, in that sense, I think is a big deal. Let's switch to Android. So, and now we'll switch from the United States mainly to Europe. Android's an interesting story. So when Google, buys it and then starts to try to build this ecosystem, one of the things they want to emphasize is that Android is open source. And there's obviously been a historic conflict between proprietary software on the one hand, open source software on the other. And Google says, this is open source. Lots of people can participate in this, and we can have sort of rich competition here. What might that competition look like? Well, we're going to do a version of Android, but other people can do other versions of Android, a so-called Android fork, which sounds like what a techie should eat dinner with, but it's not. It's actually an alternative flavor, as it were, of Android, built off of the same common code that defines the open source software. So Google pitches Android as a chance to have sort of a competition within Android, as different firms might do so-called Android forks. The reality turns out to be more complicated, and it's more complicated because while some parts of of the Android software are clearly open source and available to all, there's more software that you might want to run this system, and that's Google proprietary software. And so one of the critical things here is the Android equivalent to the App Store for Apple, that's Google Play, which brings with it the marketing, the transaction processing, the search capabilities. So Google Play, and that's proprietary software. That's Google software. There are other stores out there, though the Google Play Store clearly is, and this is what, as we get to eventually the European case on this, clearly becomes the dominant player in this space. And so Google conditions access to Google Play on a variety of contracts, and it's that contractual process, the contracting and then the tying, that eventually leads to a European Union investigation. This is if you go to the European Commission website, this is what you will see there. So as you can see, they sort of opened these proceedings in 2015 in April, and then play that through, eventually getting to a point, as you can see in 2018, where they find Google to have violated the abuse of dominance provisions of European law, and a €4 billion fine, along with requirements of remedies. The other thing to see when you look at this sheet here is that while they announced this decision with a press release, the public opinion doesn't come out until basically 14 months later. So it's this sort of very odd world where the parties obviously know what's happened, insiders know what's happened in a detailed sense. The public really does not. And they spend 14 months, I take it, redacting the eventual opinion which is issued. That opinion's 327 pages maybe, 327 or 329, with lots of redactions. But note this window of the difference in knowledge that insiders have and outsiders do not have. The only good thing to say about that is having recently read the full version of the opinion, it's worth doing, though it's a slog. it's not obvious to me there's a lot more in that beyond what you would have gotten out of the press release. So the press release that's issued in 2018 lays out the European Commission's case against Google. That case focuses on Google's dominance in a number of markets, the general search market, what they call the licensing smart mobile operating systems, which is to say, not including Apple because Apple doesn't license iOS, and then the app stores for Android devices, as I was just describing it. I do want to talk a little bit about the competition in this space, and I wrote something on that right after the decision came out. I do think you want to think of the original competition, and I set this up earlier. You had Symbian, you had Research in Motion, that's BlackBerry, you had Microsoft, and obviously then you have these new entrants, effectively Apple and Android. They're bringing very different models to bear. Obviously, the iPhone was a revolutionary device, and Apple's highly vertically integrated. Google Android was really running a sort of a two-sided market strategy. Here, handset makers take this software. We won't charge you for the software, but it will come with pieces of software, Google Search and the like, which will make it possible for us to make money. So we're going to play a two-sided market strategy. We'll make money through advertising, and that means we can lower the price of the operating system to you, make it free, and that should lower the price of the devices. So a very different strategy. Microsoft was a competitor in this market, and Microsoft had played its traditional strategy with regard to operating systems, and that strategy is we'll sell it to anybody. They've done that with regard to MS-DOS. They've done that with regard to Windows. And that's what they wanted to do with the Windows Mobile OS as well. And I think what we should take away from that competition, I don't think the European Commission sees this as clearly as they should, is that the only piece of this that was clearly rejected was what Windows was doing. Obviously, the Apple piece succeeds in an important way. Obviously, Android succeeds in an important way. Symbian, Nokia, Research in Motion, they really never make the transition at all. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. It's clear that there were two interesting business models in play here. A vertically integrated one by Apple, a two-sided version by Google. And both of those succeed in the marketplace in very interesting ways. And the fact that the Commission doesn't see that as the nature of the competition, I regard as sort of a conceptual problem in the decision that they ultimately issue. They frame this as a tying case. So if you want Google Play, which eventually becomes sort of the key thing to have, you have to bring Google Search with it. You have to bring Chrome with it. Those are effectively the tools that Google is going to use to monetize their investment in Android. But the EC says, no, that's impermissible tying. One of the things that you get clearly out of reading the opinion, and there's a lot of behavior in the marketplace that emphasizes this as well, is just how important pre-installation is in these markets. We think everything's easily downloadable. Why should it matter? And yet everything that we've seen suggests it does. So in this particular example that the Commission talks through, they say there were a limited number of situations where people were buying Windows Mobile phones. Those came with Bing pre-installed, and Bing did extremely well in those circumstances. I assume those were all people who worked for Microsoft. Can't be quite right, but not a lot of Windows Mobile phones out there. And so the fact that someone buys a Windows phone and says, I can live with Bing, I guess I don't find that super surprising. But the stickiness of the default settings on these devices, and therefore the importance of pre-installation, that comes across clearly in the Commission's opinion or statement, and they give you a nice window into that in the release up front. There were a couple of other things that Google did, including some exclusivity and some limiting competition provisions, effectively shrinking the ability to have these Android forks. Honestly, if I were giving Google advice up front, I think I would have said, run with the tying. I understand the business framework for that. 2 and 3, how much is it buying you in the marketplace? And it seems like it's almost certainly likely to give rise to antitrust issues. So, okay, so what should we do with this, you might say? The commission finds that Google Play becomes dominant and that it was therefore, the tying was an abuse, a 4.3 billion euro fine, and then a demand for remedies. As I said, this came out on July 18th. I published a piece on it 5 days later at University of Chicago booth, our business school blog at the Stigler Center. ProMarket is the blog. You can go there and read that. I sort of lay out this vision of the different competitive business models between Apple, Google, and Windows. And the failure of a model which forces someone to charge an affirmative fee for the mobile operating system, the natural consequence, and this is what I said in this piece, of not allowing the tying is to force Google to charge a fee for Android, to make them charge a positive price for that, and of course that's the path they would eventually go down. That's not very surprising. It's exactly what you would expect. And so the commission is effectively forcing us into a business model that consumers affirmatively rejected. And I'm not sure I see the virtues of that. All right. So where to go from here? So where to go from here is what's the remedy going to look like? And the remedy that Google starts to put in place is what they refer to as the choice screen. For those of you who remember your Microsoft history, we had the browser choice screen or the browser ballot, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. This is clearly another version of that. So the idea would be that when you turn on an Android device, the initial version of this is Google would be, as it were, pre-installed, and you could choose a different search engine or choose another browser. Pop up a screen and say, what would you like to do here? Eventually, they switched to an auction model. And so in that auction model, you're actually buying these positions. It's not obvious why other firms should get free distribution from Google. Distribution is valuable, really valuable, and we'll see a figure on that here in just a few seconds. And so they've switched to this auction model. There's some details about how to do that, but it's, Google. Keyword auctions is what Google does. That's how they make their money in the advertising space, so they know how to run auctions. But it does mean that there's sort of a kind of neutral, Google characterizes it as fair, competition to figure out who's going to be on the choice screen that's turned on when you boot up an Android phone in Europe. That's not to say that you can't still, as a search engine maker, try to get pre-installed. And as I said before, we know pre-installation is really valuable. How do we know that? I think the best evidence on that is that Google pays Apple, you can see the figures here, between $9 and $12 billion a year to be pre-installed on Apple devices. Google has no way to get on those devices other than having consumers download them, and consumers know how to do that. But Google sees it as sufficiently valuable to be pre-installed on Apple devices that they write a huge check to Apple. And so if there's any doubt about the importance of pre-installation, I think this is in some sense the best evidence of that. The auction results are sort of interesting for who's there and who's not there. So these are the results of the most recent Android choice screen auction. So you see DuckDuckGo, they specialize in sort of offering a privacy version. Privacy Wall, I don't know them, I assume they're doing the same thing. What's interesting is what's missing there. Microsoft has spent billions of dollars on Bing, and here when push comes to shove, they don't seem to be interested in spending money to get onto a choice screen. Now, all of this from the European Commission's perspective is about what Google's position in search looks like. That position in search is stunning. These are worldwide figures, as you can see. Bing is in second place, if you can call someone with a 3% market share as being in second place to someone with a 92% market share. DuckDuckGo, as you can see, is under 0.5%. So Google's market position here worldwide, and you see similar figures in Europe, maybe even slightly higher in most of Europe, is really remarkable. And that's been true over time. So if you look at this is, I think, from 2009 to 2020, man, that's like a flat line. So Google, in some sense, brilliantly played the transition from the desktop to mobile. That's been sort of the big issue here for a firm like Google, Facebook as well. Their success in doing this, not allowing that device transition to disrupt their business, remarkably successful. Now, I mentioned browser choice. So the choice screen that we're seeing in Europe for Android, we know what that looks like. And so when Microsoft was getting ready to roll out Windows 7 in Europe, the Commission was concerned that Microsoft was, in its view, perhaps tying Internet Explorer to Windows. They said they were going to bring a case against Microsoft. They settled. And they settled with this browser choice screen where there were 14 browsers presented. The top 5 were randomly allocated. You can see there's a horizontal scroll on that page. The irony of that, the US case in 2000, one of the premises of that was that having two browser icons would be confusing to consumers. Now we're up to 14. But the point I want to make sure we see here is that it's not obvious that the browser choice screen mattered in important ways. Indeed, it turned out, I think accidentally, though Microsoft writes a big check for this, that it was broken for a while. When they rolled out the Service Pack update for Windows 7, they broke the browser choice screen. No one seemed to notice for an extended period of time. So it's not obvious that the browser choice screen really mattered. And so one of the questions you want to ask about sort of really Google Android, and maybe about Google Shopping, though I'm not talking about that, is what has the European Commission actually accomplished with regard to competition on the ground in these spaces, notwithstanding the fact that it's run these very involved cases. Okay, almost done here. So I'll just tee up that they're getting ready to do more cases. Basically last month they announced 2 investigations into Apple. One of those is going to relate to the App Store. Spotify filed a complaint with the European Commission. That complaint focused on the 30% fee, also focused on access to things like the APIs, the application programming interface. Can you use all of the innards of the Apple Watch? So that investigation has been launched. An investigation into Apple Pay. The European Commission is concerned that as we move to contactless transactions in the COVID era, these sort of digital wallets, we could be at a tipping point for that. Is Apple treating that in a neutral way? The allegation is that this hardware device, the near field communication capability of the iPhone, maybe is something that Apple gets insider access to and outsiders get inferior access to it. So that's one of the investigations. I wrote another blog post, so if you want to read that, you can go read that. I think the App Store and the 30% figure is actually much more complicated than sort of the 30% figure itself suggests. I'm talking on Sunday. Today is July 26th, it looks like. We are going to have this epic hearing now on Wednesday, where all four of the GAFA CEOs are going to appear virtually, it says. So who knows who's actually there. The House has been investigating digital marketplaces, and that investigation is coming towards an end. And this hearing should be epic. You will be watching this video after that hearing, so you will know more about it than I do. I've organized some, as part of that investigation, the House asked a number of people to write statements about what was going on. I wrote one of those. A bunch of people wrote those. I've been doing some, not hearings, but sessions, sort of workshops online on these. 4 Fridays in July was the conception, 5 hours of video done with CPI, Competition Policy International. So you can go watch those videos if you want to see what those look like. And I do have a statement as well that you can obviously read if you're so inclined. Again, I want to say thanks for letting me participate this way. I know that you're doing this over Zoom. I think we all feel distance. There's a way in which Zoom makes us all closer. These sessions I've been able to do on these 4 Fridays, we've had people from Brazil and Europe, and it's sort of easy to do. But it's not a substitute, as we all understand, for coming together. And I hope we'll get back to that point soon. So thank you very much. You know how to reach me if you have comments or questions. Thanks.